You're 14 years old. Your heart is pounding so hard you can hear it in your skull. Ahead of you, thick wooden doors carved with angels stand half open. Beyond them, candlelight flickers against stone walls. You've been told this is where you become a queen. What no one told you is that 23 men are already inside, hidden behind curtains and secret panels, watching, waiting. You step forward, and the doors close behind you with a sound like a tomb sealing shut. This happened on the night of October 25th, 1533, in the royal palace of Marseille. The girl was Catherine de Medici, a 14-year-old Italian orphan married into French royalty. History remembers her as one of the most ruthless queens Europe ever produced. But history doesn't talk much about that wedding night. What happened in that chamber wasn't recorded in any official chronicle. It was whispered about in corridors, passed down through noble families like a ghost story, and centuries later, when Vatican archivists opened sealed boxes marked with faded red wax, they found letters written in Catherine's own hand, letters stained with something that might have been blood, letters that described not a wedding, but a ritual of humiliation so deliberate, so cruel, that it broke something inside her. And when she healed, what grew back wasn't soft anymore. Before we go deeper, I'd love to know, are you watching this from Europe, the Americas, Asia? It amazes me how a story this dark, buried for centuries, still pulls us in from every corner of the world. Drop a comment and let me know where you're from. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand who Catherine was before she entered that room. She wasn't supposed to be important. She was born in Florence in 1519, the daughter of Lorenzo de Medici, Duke of Urbino. But her mother died giving birth to her, and her father died 3 weeks later. She was an orphan before she could speak. The Medici family, one of the wealthiest and most powerful in Europe, raised her in convents. She learned Latin, Greek, history, philosophy. She studied herbalism and alchemy under her Aunt Clarice, who taught her which plants could heal and which could kill. By the age of 12, Catherine spoke 5 languages and understood political strategy better than most grown men. She was brilliant, disciplined, and alone. Then, in 1533, everything changed. Pope Clement VII, her uncle, arranged her marriage to Henri, Duke of Orléans, second son of King Francis III of France. It was a political alliance meant to bind Italy and France. Catherine brought an enormous dowry and the promise of Medici wealth. In return, she would become part of the French royal family. On paper, it was a triumph. But the French court despised her. They called her the merchant's daughter. They mocked her Italian accent, her foreign manners, the way she held a fork. And worst of all, Henri already had someone else. Her name was Diane de Poitiers. She was 34 years old, elegant, calculating, and utterly in control of Henri. He was 15. She had been his lover since he was 12. Diane didn't just influence him, she owned him. And she hated Catherine from the moment the Italian girl arrived in France. Diane made sure everyone knew that this marriage was a joke, a business transaction, nothing more. Henri would never love Catherine. He would never even pretend to. But there was something else, something darker, something that wasn't written in any official record. Hidden among the Vatican papers were references to an old practice called the purification ceremony. It was a ritual forced on foreign brides who married into royal bloodlines, a way to test whether they were worthy. It was never codified, never spoken about openly. It existed in whispers, in instructions passed from one generation of nobles to the next. And on Catherine's wedding night, Diane de Poitiers made sure that ritual would be performed in full. The wedding itself was lavish. Thousands attended. There was music, feasting, fireworks over the harbor. Pope Clement himself officiated the ceremony. Catherine wore cloth of gold, her hair braided with pearls. She looked like a princess from a storybook. But as the celebrations went on, she began to notice something. Certain noblemen kept glancing at her with strange smiles. Women whispered and looked away when she caught their eyes. Diane stood beside Henri the entire time, whispering in his ear, touching his arm, making it clear who really held power. When night fell, Catherine was led through the palace corridors by silent attendants. Torches lined the walls, casting long shadows that seemed to follow her. Her hands, hidden inside silk gloves, were damp with sweat. She had been told what to expect in vague, modest terms. She believed she was about to begin her life as a wife. What she didn't know was that 23 members of the French nobility had already gathered in secret passages and hidden alcoves built into the walls of the bridal chamber. They had been invited. This was part of the ritual. They would watch, judge, and later they would laugh about it over wine. At first, it seemed almost normal. Henri entered the room. He was young, handsome, nervous. He spoke to her gently. Catherine began to relax. But then his tone changed. His hands, which had been careful, became rough. And she realized with a sick clarity that he wasn't acting on instinct. He was following instructions. Diane had trained him. Every movement, every word had been rehearsed. This wasn't intimacy. It was performance. And behind the walls she could hear them. Muffled laughter, the clink of goblets, whispers in French she couldn't quite make out. She tried to speak, to ask him to stop, but Henri didn't respond. He looked past her as if she wasn't really there. The pain came in waves, worse each time. She cried out in Italian, begging for mercy, but no one answered. The room smelled like wine and burning wax. Her vision blurred. At some point she fainted. When she woke, a court physician named André Dubois was standing over her, pressing a cloth soaked in something sharp and cold against her face. He revived her, checked her pulse, and then left the room without a word. It happened again, and again. 3 times before dawn, she lost consciousness. 3 times they brought her back. Each time she opened her eyes, she saw Henri's face, blank and obedient, and behind him, shadows moving behind the curtains. By the time the sun rose, Catherine could barely stand. Her eyes were bloodshot, the tiny veins burst from crying. Her hands shook. But she didn't scream anymore. She didn't beg. She was silent. Servants helped her dress. They avoided looking at her directly. She walked through the palace like a ghost, her face pale, her expression unreadable. The nobles who had watched whispered among themselves, laughing about how long she had lasted, whether she would survive the marriage, whether Henri would ever touch her again. Diane de Poitiers smiled, satisfied. The Italian girl had been put in her place, but something had shifted. Catherine wasn't broken. She was awake. For the first time in her life, she understood exactly how power worked. It wasn't about bloodlines or beauty or even intelligence. It was about control, patience, and the willingness to do what others wouldn't. And she realized something else. She remembered every face, every name, every laugh, the men who had watched, the women who had whispered, Diane, who had orchestrated it all, and Henri, who had obeyed. In the weeks that followed, Catherine said almost nothing. She attended court functions, smiled when required, learned French customs. She made no complaints. She asked for nothing. To everyone else, she seemed defeated, harmless, forgettable. But in her private chambers, she began to write. She kept a diary, hidden inside a locked chest beneath her bed. In it, she recorded 23 names. She wrote down their titles, their families, their habits. She wrote where they had stood that night, what they had said, how they had looked at her. Each entry was detailed, methodical, exact. This wasn't a journal. It was a ledger, and every name would be balanced. Catherine had been trained in herbalism since childhood. Her Aunt Clarice had taught her the properties of belladonna, hemlock, mercury, nightshade. She knew how to extract poison from flowers, how to blend compounds that acted slowly, invisibly. She had been taught these things as medicine, as scholarship. Now she would use them as weapons. For 3 years, she did nothing. She played the role of the quiet, obedient wife. Henri ignored her. Diane continued to control him. The court forgot about the Italian girl entirely, but Catherine was studying. She read books on anatomy, on digestion, on how different poisons affected the body. She experimented in secret, using servants' meals as tests, watching symptoms, adjusting doses. She became an expert, and when she was ready, she began. Her first target was Jean de Montmorency, a minor nobleman who had been one of the loudest voices that night. She remembered his laugh, high-pitched and cruel. She remembered the way he had raised his goblet in a mock toast as she screamed. His death needed to match his crime. Catherine prepared a mixture of hemlock and mercury, designed to cause violent convulsions, frothing at the mouth, hours of agony before death. She had a servant deliver a bottle of wine to his chambers, accompanied by a small card that read only, "Do you remember October 25th, 1533? Jean de Montmorency died 2 days later. The court physicians ruled it food poisoning. No one suspected anything. Catherine attended his funeral, her face composed, her hands folded. Inside, she felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not guilt, just clarity. One name crossed off. 22 to go. Over the next 15 years, Catherine killed methodically. She chose her moments carefully, spacing the deaths far enough apart that no pattern emerged. Some died quickly. Others suffered for weeks, their bodies slowly failing as poison accumulated in their organs. Each death was tailored to the person, a reflection of what they had done, what they had said. A woman who had mocked Catherine's accent died choking, unable to speak. A man who had bet on how long she would last died slowly, over months, losing weight and strength until he was unrecognizable. Catherine never rushed. She never made mistakes. And she never forgot. But there was one name that mattered more than all the others. Diane de Poitiers. The woman who had designed the ritual, who had trained Henri, who had made sure Catherine's wedding night would be a nightmare. Killing Diane required something different. It couldn't be quick. It had to be invisible. It had to look like age, like nature, like fate. Catherine began adding tiny amounts of poison to Diane's food and wine. The doses were so small they caused no immediate symptoms, just a gradual weakening. Over months, Diane began to feel tired. Her memory slipped. Her skin, once flawless, grew dull. She consulted doctors who found nothing wrong. She prayed, changed her diet, rested more. Nothing helped. She was fading, and she didn't know why. Catherine watched it happen, meal by meal, year by year. She attended every banquet, every gathering, sitting across from Diane with a gentle smile, offering her wine, complimenting her dress. And slowly, Diane disappeared. She died in 1566, at the age of 66, after drinking a cup of wine Catherine had personally handed her at a court dinner. The doctors said her organs had simply failed. Catherine stood at her funeral, her face serene, and felt the weight of that name finally lift. It had taken decades, but it was done. By then, most of the other names were gone too. Courtiers who had laughed that night died in strange accidents, sudden illnesses, unexplained fevers. Whispers spread through the court about a blood curse haunting those who had wronged the queen. But it wasn't a curse. It was Catherine. And there was still one name left, the most important one. Henri. King Henri II died on July 10, 1559, 10 days after a jousting accident during a tournament celebrating peace with Spain. His opponent, Captain Gabriel de Montgomery, shattered his lance against Henri's helmet, and a splinter pierced his eye. Henri suffered terribly, hallucinating, convulsing, in agony until his death. The court mourned. Catherine wept publicly. But later analysis of the preserved lance showed traces of an organic toxin, something that wouldn't kill immediately but would intensify pain, prolong suffering, ensure that death came slowly. No one could ever prove Catherine's involvement. But on Henri's tomb, carved into the stone, was a symbol, 3 interlocking circles with a single vertical line through the center, the same symbol Catherine had drawn in her own blood on the wall of the bridal chamber in 1533. When Henri died, Catherine became regent of France. She ruled for 30 years, one of the most powerful women in European history. She never remarried, she never forgave, and in her private papers discovered centuries later, there was a final entry in her diary. It read, "They thought I would forget. They thought I was nothing. But I remembered every name, every face, every laugh, and now they are all gone, and I am still here." The letter found in the Vatican archives, the one stained with blood, ended with a single line written in Latin, "Dolor meus, corona mea." My pain, my crown. Those 4 words weren't just a motto. They were a transformation written in ink and blood, a declaration that what had been done to her in darkness would become the source of her light, her authority, her unshakable will. Catherine had learned something that night in 1533 that most people never understand. Suffering, when it doesn't destroy you, can be refined into something far more potent than happiness ever could be. It becomes clarity, purpose, an engine that never stops running. Catherine de Medici's story wasn't written in the history books the way it really happened. The wedding night, the ritual, the 23 witnesses, none of it made it into official records. Royal scribes didn't document the humiliation of queens. Priests didn't speak of rituals that shamed the church. Nobles who participated took their secrets to the grave, or so they thought. But the evidence survived anyway, hidden in places power couldn't easily reach. Letters tucked inside prayer books, diary entries sewn into the linings of trunks, confessions sealed with red wax and locked in Vatican vaults, marked only with numbers, waiting centuries for someone to break them open and read what had been deliberately forgotten. And what they reveal is this: sometimes the most powerful people in history weren't born into power. They didn't inherit thrones with clean hands and clear consciences. They were forged by pain. They were shaped by cruelty so precise, so calculated, that it rewired something fundamental inside them. They learned that the world doesn't give you justice. It doesn't even acknowledge injustice unless you make it impossible to ignore. You have to take justice yourself, name by name, year by year, until every debt is paid and the scales finally balance. Catherine understood this with a purity that terrified those who eventually figured out what she had become. She never raged. She never made grand speeches about revenge. She simply waited, watched, and acted when the moment was perfect. Her patience was inhuman. Her memory was absolute. And her methods were so subtle that even as nobles began dying around her, even as the court whispered about curses and divine punishment, no one dared accuse the quiet Italian queen who spent her days in prayer and her nights reading by candlelight. She had become invisible in plain sight, the way only the truly dangerous can. Catherine lived to be 69 years old, an extraordinary lifespan for her era. She outlived everyone who hurt her. She outlived her husband, her enemies, even most of her children. She watched France tear itself apart in religious wars, and she navigated every crisis with the same cold intelligence she had used to plan her private war of retribution. She became regent, then queen mother, then the power behind 3 kings. Historians call her reign ruthless, Machiavellian, stained with blood. And they're right, but they rarely ask why. They rarely trace the line back to that October night when a 14-year-old girl learned that mercy is a luxury only the powerful can afford, and she was not yet powerful. When Catherine finally died on January 5, 1589, in the Château de Blois, she was still wearing a locket around her neck. It was small, made of tarnished silver, unremarkable. Her attendants tried to remove it, but she had gripped it even in her final moments, her fingers locked around the chain. When they finally pried it open, they found a scrap of yellowed paper inside, folded tight. On it were 23 names written in faded ink, and beside each name, a single line drawn through it. Every single one crossed out. Not erased, not forgotten, acknowledged marked, completed. The list of a girl who had been broken. The legacy of a queen who had made sure no one would ever break her again.